Snow had been falling since morning. By noon, it had buried the sidewalks outside the Foley Square courthouse in a layer of white, so clean it looked artificial, like a film set someone had dressed for a scene about endings. The kind of snow that muffled everything: footsteps, voices, the low groan of a city that never fully stopped. Inside courtroom 14B, nothing was muffled. The radiators hissed. The fluorescent lights hummed at a frequency that made the back of your teeth ache. 43 people sat in the gallery: lawyers, paralegals, 2 junior associates from Brennan and Hale who had tagged along to watch what their senior partner called a textbook settlement, a few spectators, a court reporter with nail polish the color of dried blood. Ethan Cole sat at the respondent's table. He wore a gray wool sweater, dark trousers, and shoes that had been resoled twice. He had not hired a stylist. He had not brought a second chair of support. His attorney, Daniel Marsh, a good man with a thinning hairline and an expression permanently caught between concern and apology, sat beside him shuffling papers he had already shuffled 3 times. At the petitioner's table, Vanessa Cole sat perfectly still. She wore a charcoal Armani suit with a single pearl button at the collar. Her attorney, Gregory Hale, the one whose name appeared on the firm's letterhead in letters larger than any partner before him, had his hands folded in front of him like a man who had already collected his fee and was merely waiting for the formality to conclude. Judge Patricia Weston read the terms aloud. The marital home on East 74th Street. The investment accounts at Meridian Wealth. The joint brokerage. The art collection. The car. The vacation property in Connecticut that Ethan had spent 2 summers renovating by hand. Each item landed in the courtroom like a stone dropped into still water. Ethan listened. He did not flinch. When Judge Weston finished, she looked at him over the rim of her glasses with the measured patience of someone who had seen this particular story many times. Mr. Cole, your counsel has indicated you are prepared to accept these terms without contest. Is that correct? Daniel shifted in his seat. He had spent the past 3 weeks trying to change Ethan's mind. He had prepared counter-arguments, asset valuations, a psychological evaluation that would have established a pattern of marital financial imbalance. He had done everything a good attorney could do. And Ethan had read each document carefully, thanked him for each one, and declined every strategy with the same quiet finality. That's correct, Ethan said. His voice was even, no tremor, no tightness. Gregory Hale permitted himself a small, controlled exhale. In the gallery, one of the junior associates leaned toward the other and whispered something. The court reporter's fingers paused above her keys for exactly 1 second before resuming. Vanessa did not look at Ethan. She had not looked at him once during the proceeding. She kept her gaze on the middle distance, chin slightly elevated, the way people hold themselves when they are performing composure rather than feeling it. She had worked for this outcome for 14 months. She had earned it. She saw no reason to acknowledge the man she was leaving behind. The settlement documents were placed before Ethan. Daniel pointed to the signature lines, each marked with a small yellow tab. Ethan read the final page carefully. Not the page Daniel expected him to read, but a different page, one near the middle that Gregory had drafted as standard boilerplate. He read it twice. He made no comment. Then he signed. 6 lines, 6 signatures. The pen moved without hesitation. When it was done, a sound moved through the gallery. It wasn't laughter, not exactly. It was the social equivalent of a raised eyebrow, a collective exhale of mild amusement at a man who had simply handed everything over. One of the junior associates pressed her lips together to contain a smile. Gregory uncapped his fountain pen and signed the attorney certification with the unhurried confidence of someone completing a routine administrative task. Vanessa finally looked at Ethan, just once. A flicker. Her expression said everything it needed to say. I was always the one holding this together. Then she looked away again. Judge Weston stamped the documents. The court accepts the settlement agreement. This dissolution is final, as of today's date. She gathered her papers. We're adjourned. The gavel came down. Ethan sat still for a moment, after everyone else began to move. He straightened the stack of papers in front of him. He replaced the cap on the pen. He stood, buttoned his coat, and turned toward the door. Daniel touched his arm. Ethan, are you? "I'm fine," Ethan said. "Thank you, Daniel. Send me the final invoice." He walked out of courtroom 14B into the marble corridor, through the heavy oak doors, and down the courthouse steps into the snow. Nobody watched him go. There was nothing to watch. Vanessa Cole had not started with anything. That was the story she told at conferences, at panels. In the one long profile a financial magazine had run 3 years ago under the headline "Built from Scratch." She had grown up in a 3-bedroom house in Westchester with parents who clipped grocery coupons and drove used cars and believed that ambition, rigorously applied, could compensate for capital. She had taken that belief and turned it into something extraordinary. She held an MBA from Wharton. She had spent 7 years climbing the ranks at a boutique investment advisory before founding Vantage Capital Group at 31. With 2 colleagues and a line of credit she spent 4 months negotiating. Within 5 years, Vantage had grown from a startup to a firm managing just under $2 billion in assets. She had been named to 2 industry lists, spoken at Davos once, and been photographed for a business magazine cover in a way that conveyed both approachability and absolute authority. She was, in every measurable sense, someone who had won. Gregory Hale had been her attorney for 6 years. He was not the kind of lawyer who lost. His record in high-asset divorce proceedings was 16-0. He had handled cases involving tech founders, inherited estate disputes, celebrity marriages, and one deeply complicated situation involving a hedge fund manager and a second family nobody had known about. He had prevailed in all of them. His confidence in this case had been, from the beginning, something close to certainty. "She's leaving nothing on the table," he had told his assistant during the initial filing. "She never does." What he meant was that Vanessa had been meticulous. Every asset had been documented, valued, and allocated. The marital home had been appraised 3 times. The investment accounts had been audited. The art collection had been cataloged by a specialist from Sotheby's. Nothing had been overlooked. Nothing had been left to interpretation. Gregory had reviewed Ethan's financial disclosures himself. The man had some savings, a modest consulting income he had maintained while raising their daughter during the years Vanessa was building Vantage, and a small position in 2 mid-tier index funds. There was nothing remarkable, nothing hidden, as far as the disclosure forms showed. Gregory had, in his career, encountered genuinely concealed wealth many times. He knew the signs. Shell companies registered in unexpected jurisdictions. Unusual gaps in employment history accompanied by unexplained lifestyle. Consulting fees that didn't correspond to any identifiable client. Asset transfers in the 18 months preceding a filing. He had looked for all of it. He had found none of it. He had concluded, as he nearly always did when his search returned, nothing, that there was nothing to find. This was, in retrospect, the most significant error of his professional career. Not that he had missed something he had searched for, but that he had searched for the wrong thing entirely. He had been looking for concealment. He had not been looking for structure. The distinction was not subtle. It was the entire difference between a secret and a strategy. The clause Ethan had requested a brief addendum near the middle of the settlement document had read as follows. The respondent voluntarily waives any claim to assets, financial instruments, or beneficial interests not disclosed in the petitioner's financial schedule as of the settlement date, and the petitioner similarly waives any claim to assets, financial instruments, or beneficial interests not disclosed in the respondent's financial schedule as of the settlement date. Gregory had read it. He had read it carefully, the way a lawyer reads everything. He had found it unremarkable. It was a mutual waiver clause. Both parties were simply agreeing that whatever was not on the table stayed off the table. Standard language, often used to prevent parties from surfacing hidden assets after a settlement concluded. He had nodded. He had moved on. Vanessa had read it too, quickly, and agreed. She had nothing hidden. She was meticulous. She had put everything on the table because she had nothing to fear from transparency. That was, as it turned out, the most expensive assumption of her professional life. The week before the settlement, Daniel Marsh had made one final attempt. He had asked Ethan to meet him at his office on a Tuesday morning, and Ethan had arrived on time, taken the chair across from Daniel's desk, and accepted a cup of coffee he barely touched. Daniel had prepared a folder. He opened it. "I want to walk through this one more time," Daniel said. Ethan waited. You have a legitimate claim to assets acquired during the marriage, regardless of whose name they're in. The consulting work you did managing her calendar, coordinating with her investors, serving as a de facto chief of staff for the first 3 years of Vantage, that work has monetary value. I've spoken with 2 forensic accountants who believe we can make a strong argument for Daniel, at minimum, an additional 8 to 12 million in Daniel. Ethan's voice was not unkind. I understand what you're doing. I appreciate it. But I've made my decision. Daniel set down his pen. He was 61 years old and had seen a great many people make decisions under duress that they later regretted. He had learned to read the specific quality of a man who was capitulating out of exhaustion versus a man who was capitulating out of something else entirely. He looked at Ethan for a long moment. Ethan's hands were folded on the table. His posture was relaxed. His eyes were clear. He did not look like a man who had given up. He looked like a man watching a clock he had already set. "You're not worried," Daniel said. It was not a question. Ethan looked at him. A pause. Measured and deliberate. "I'm focused," he said. "On what? On what comes next?" Daniel held his gaze for 3 more seconds, then looked down at his folder. He closed it. He had spent 32 years as an attorney, and he had learned that there were certain clients you could steer and certain clients you could only accompany. He had just, he realized, been reclassified. "All right," he said. "Then let's make sure the clause language is exactly what you want." They spent 90 minutes on 2 paragraphs. When Ethan left, Daniel sat at his desk for a while before returning his calls. He picked up the folder again. He reread the clause. He read it a 3rd time. He put the folder down and looked out his window at the gray November sky. He thought, either this man is making the most expensive mistake of his life, or someone else is. He was not certain which possibility unsettled him more. There is a particular type of precision that disguises itself as simplicity. The clause Ethan had drafted with some quiet assistance from an attorney who did not work for Daniel Marsh, whose name appeared nowhere in the settlement proceedings, and who had billed the consultation to a trust nobody would think to examine, was 18 lines long. It contained no unusual terminology. It did not flag any alert in Gregory Hale's review, because Gregory Hale was looking for clauses that concealed assets. And this clause appeared to expose them. A mutual waiver. Clean, balanced, reasonable. What it actually said, in the language of financial law, interpreted strictly, was this. Both parties were waiving claims to anything not disclosed. Vanessa had disclosed everything she owned, as she understood her ownership. Her assets were clean. Her disclosure was complete. Except that Vanessa's disclosure was complete only according to what she knew, and there were things she did not know. She did not know, for instance, that the fund which held a significant equity position in Arlon Systems, the technology infrastructure company she had been quietly targeting for a major acquisition, was not owned by its stated management company. The management company was a holding entity. The holding entity reported to a Delaware-registered trust. The trust had been structured 18 months ago, long before any divorce proceedings, by a man who understood the difference between ownership and visibility. She did not know that the man behind that trust had spent 4 years, while she built Vantage Capital Group, quietly building something else. Something with no name on the door, no press mentions, no profile piece in any financial publication, because it had been designed from the beginning to be invisible. She did not know this because she had never thought to look. She had looked at Ethan Cole and seen a man who managed school pickups and dinner schedules and the occasional freelance consulting engagement. She had seen a supporting character in the story of her own ambition, a man who had the flexibility of someone without direction. She had not considered that flexibility could be a strategy. She had not considered that someone with nothing to prove might have been proving something the entire time just in a language she didn't know how to read. The clause she had signed said, simply, that she waived any claim to assets not disclosed on his schedule. He had disclosed his index funds, his savings account, his consulting income. All of it accurate, all of it complete. With respect to what was in his name, she had agreed, simultaneously, that he waived any claim to assets not on her schedule, meaning anything she discovered after the settlement date, she would be navigating alone. The door had swung shut, She had closed it herself. Ethan stood outside the courthouse for 4 minutes. The snow was still coming down, fine and persistent. The kind that doesn't accumulate in dramatic drifts, but layers itself quietly over everything until the world looks different than it did before. He stood on the steps without his collar turned up, his hands in his coat pockets, looking at nothing in particular. He took out his phone. He typed 7 words. "It's done. Move forward. I'll call tonight." He sent it to a contact listed as CW. He put the phone away. A man in a suit stepped out behind him, one of Gregory's junior associates, probably headed for a cab. He glanced at Ethan the way you glance at a stranger whose presence registers but doesn't hold your attention. A man in a gray sweater outside a courthouse in the snow. Nothing remarkable. Ethan walked down the steps and turned left. He walked 2 blocks to a coffee shop he had been to 3 times before, a small place with fogged windows and a counter that smelled like burned grounds and something sweet underneath. He ordered black coffee. He took a seat at a window table where he could see the street. He thought about his daughter, Lily, who was 8 years old and currently at school, and who had, that morning at breakfast, asked him if everything was going to be okay. He had looked at her over her cereal bowl and said yes. He had meant it completely. He thought about what it cost to mean something completely. Not the words were easy. He meant the thing behind the words. The actual, practical certainty that the shape of their life together would hold. That the school pickups and the dinners and the homework and the weekend routines that she depended on, without being able to articulate her dependence, all of it would continue, because he had made sure it could continue, because he had spent 4 years constructing the architecture of that certainty from the outside in, quietly and without assistance, before this morning had ever arrived. He thought about the 6 signatures he had just applied to 6 lines of paper. He thought about what people see when they look at a man with a gray sweater and resoled shoes sitting alone in a coffee shop on a Tuesday. The assumptions that form automatically, involuntarily, based on nothing more than the appearance of simplicity. He had spent a long time understanding this particular variety of human perception, the way the absence of visible performance is interpreted as the absence of substance, and he had found it, in the end, more useful than almost anything else he had ever learned. He drank his coffee. His phone buzzed. CW had replied. Understood. Westfield confirmed for Thursday. Arlon presentation is set. You want me on site? He typed back, no, I'll handle it. He finished his coffee. He left a $5 tip on a $3 drink, put on his coat, and walked back out into the snow. Carter Wells had known Ethan Cole for 11 years. They had met at a small conference in Boston, not a major industry event, but the kind of second-tier gathering where serious people go when they don't want to be seen being serious. Carter had been in his late 30s, recently out of a quantitative research role at a fund he had grown tired of, looking for something to do with a particular set of skills that didn't fit neatly into any existing category. Ethan had been there representing a small technology startup as an outside advisor. They had ended up at the same table for dinner and stayed talking until the hotel restaurant closed. What they had found, over that dinner, was a shared understanding of a particular idea. That the most durable positions in any market are the ones nobody is watching. Carter had spent his career studying information asymmetry, the gap between what investors believe they know about a company and what is actually true. His insight, refined over a decade of research, was that the most profitable asymmetries exist not in exotic instruments or insider information, but in plain sight, in companies that are doing genuinely important work in fields that the major capital allocators haven't prioritized yet because the fields aren't glamorous. Infrastructure software. Logistics technology. The unsexy, invisible machinery of modern commerce. He and Ethan had begun with a small fund, not a public fund, a private trust structure, with a handful of sophisticated investors who understood what they were buying and did not need their names attached to it. Carter managed the analytical side. Ethan provided the capital judgment, the relationship architecture, and a patient, methodical approach to compounding that was, Carter had often thought, genuinely rare. Over 7 years, the trust had taken positions in 11 companies. 3 had been acquired at significant premiums. 2 were still held, growing steadily. 4 were modest. 1 had failed. The net result was a portfolio valued, as of the previous quarter, at just over $68 million, held entirely outside the standard channels that a divorce attorney would think to examine, through a chain of entities that were all fully legal, fully compliant, and perfectly invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. None of it was in Ethan Cole's name. None of it appeared on any financial disclosure he had ever filed personally. The trust owned the entities. The trust was administered by a law firm in Delaware. The law firm took instructions from Carter. Carter took direction from Ethan. It was not hidden. It was structured. The difference mattered enormously. Arlon Systems was the largest position. Ethan had identified it 4 years ago, a mid-sized infrastructure software company with a product that was, in Carter's assessment, about 2 years ahead of its category, and systematically undervalued because the founder had chosen to grow slowly and avoid venture capital attention. The company processed secure data transfers for financial institutions at a scale and efficiency no competitor had matched. It was not exciting. It did not generate press. It was, quietly, indispensable. The trust had accumulated a position representing just under 22% of Arlon's outstanding equity. Nobody on the outside knew who held it. The position was owned by a holding company whose beneficial ownership was listed in a filing that cross-referenced 3 other entities before terminating at the Delaware Trust. Vanessa had been circling Arlon for 8 months. Ethan knew this because Carter's contacts in the deal advisory space had picked up the signals, exploratory conversations, a third-party valuation request, a quiet approach to the founder through an intermediary. He had watched, he had waited. When she filed for divorce, he had begun preparing. When she agreed to the mutual waiver clause, the preparation was complete. Westfield Capital Partners had offices on the 42nd floor of a tower in Midtown, with views of the Hudson on a clear day. On Thursday, it was still snowing lighter now, but persistent, and the Hudson was a gray line below a gray sky. The conference room where Vanessa waited had a long glass table and 12 chairs, and a presentation screen at one end. She had arrived early. She always arrived early. The Arlon Systems acquisition had been her project for the better part of a year. She had built the thesis herself. Infrastructure software was consolidating. The smaller independent players were going to be absorbed over the next 36 months, and the firm that moved first on the best asset would define the next phase of its growth. Arlon was the best asset in the category. Its founder, a reserved engineer named Marcus Webb, had been reluctant to engage at first, but her team had cultivated the relationship carefully over 6 months, and he had, in the last conversation, indicated a genuine openness to exploring terms. The remaining obstacle was the equity structure. 22% of Arlon was held by an entity that had not engaged with any outreach. Her team had tried twice. No response. They had identified the holding company, but could not penetrate the ownership chain beyond a certain point. It was, her legal team had told her, almost certainly a family office or a founder-adjacent trust that would need to be brought to the table directly. She had been told the principal investor would be represented at today's meeting. She had assumed it would be someone she knew, or someone her network knew. The financial world was, at senior levels, not large. Gregory Hale was seated to her right. 2 Westfield partners were across the table. The Arlon founder, Marcus Webb, sat at the far end, looking slightly uncomfortable in a suit that fit him the way suits fit people who don't usually wear them. The door opened. A man entered. He was wearing a dark charcoal jacket, a pale blue shirt, no tie. His hair was slightly damp, as if from the cold outside. He carried a leather portfolio and moved with the ease of someone who was entirely comfortable in the room he was entering, even though no one had seen him in this room before. He took the chair at the head of the table. He looked at the room. Then he looked at Vanessa. She had gone very still. "I apologize for the delay," he said. "The weather." He set his portfolio on the table. "I'm Ethan Cole. I'm the principal investor." Nobody said anything for a moment that was just long enough to be remarkable. One of the Westfield partners, a heavy-set man named Bradford Crane, who had structured 47 acquisitions and prided himself on being unflappable, shifted very slightly in his chair. Marcus Webb, the Arlon founder, looked between Vanessa and Ethan with the expression of a man who has just realized he is in the middle of a situation he does not fully understand. Gregory Hale's eyes moved to Ethan's face and stayed there. Vanessa said nothing. She was looking at Ethan with an expression that had not yet decided what it was. Her posture had not changed. She had trained herself, over 2 decades, to hold composure under conditions that would have unraveled most people. But something in the quality of her stillness had shifted. It was less composed than it was suspended, the way a person looks in the moment between stepping off a curb and realizing the surface below is further down than they thought. Ethan opened his portfolio. "I've reviewed the proposed terms," he said, addressing Bradford Crane first, then Marcus. "There are 2 structural elements I'd like to discuss before we go further. The earnout structure needs adjustment. I think 3 years is too compressed for what Marcus is building, and I'd like to propose extending it to 5 with a modified threshold, and the equity roll percentage should be higher. He's built something with a longer runway than this deal reflects." His voice was measured, professional, exactly the voice of a man who had done this before and expected to be taken seriously. Bradford Crane looked at the 1-page summary. He looked up. "You represent the 22% block? I control it, yes. Through what entity? Crestfield Technology Trust. It's in the materials I sent Tuesday." Bradford nodded slowly. He had received those materials. He had passed them to his team. He had assumed the meeting would be with a representative. He had not assumed it would be this. Vanessa's hand, which had been resting on the table, moved to the edge of her portfolio and stopped there. Gregory Hale was doing what Gregory Hale did when something didn't fit the model he had built. He was recalculating, quickly and privately, behind an expression of professional neutrality. He was thinking about the settlement documents. He was thinking about the clause. He was thinking about the word disclosed and what it meant, precisely, in the context of the mutual waiver. He was beginning to understand what he should have understood 3 weeks ago in courtroom 14B. Ethan continued the meeting. He was fluent in the room in a way that was not performative. He did not need to demonstrate anything, and so he didn't. He asked precise questions. He listened carefully to the answers. When Bradford outlined Westfield's position, Ethan noted 2 assumptions in the financial model that he disagreed with and explained why. Briefly and without aggression. Marcus Webb, who had said almost nothing, looked at Ethan for a longer time after that. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. At the end, Bradford Crane stood and extended his hand. "We'll reconvene Monday with updated terms." Ethan shook it. "I'll have my comments to you by end of day Friday." He gathered his portfolio. He nodded to Marcus. He turned toward the door. Vanessa said his name. It was the first time she had spoken it in the room. The first time she had spoken it, he realized, since the courthouse. It came out slightly differently than she'd intended, not the controlled register she'd been trained to produce under pressure, but something that started at the wrong pitch and corrected itself halfway through. He turned. She was still seated. Gregory had his hand on her arm. Very lightly. The way an attorney touches a client when he wants them to stop before they say something. Vanessa said nothing else. Ethan looked at her for a moment. Not with satisfaction, not with coldness. With something that was simply recognition, the acknowledgement of a thing that had been true for a while and was now visible. Then he turned and walked out. Gregory Hale had a rule. He had operated by this rule for 22 years. Never revisit a case in your head while the case is still alive. Doubt, once introduced, spreads. Trust the preparation. Trust the work. He broke that rule on Thursday evening. He sat in his office on the 31st floor. He had sent his assistant home. He had declined 2 calls. He had not turned on the lamp, so he was sitting in the glow of his monitor, in a room going dark around him, and he read the settlement document from the beginning. He read it the way he should have read it in the first place, not for what was there, but for what was made possible by what was there. The mutual waiver clause. He read it 4 times. He called a colleague in Delaware trust law. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. When he hung up, he sat for a moment without moving. Then he called Vanessa. She picked up on the second ring. "The Crestfield Trust," he said. "I need you to tell me if you knew anything about it before today." A pause. "I didn't." "And Ethan's financial disclosure in the settlement, did you review it personally? You told me it was clean." "It was clean. That's not what I asked." Another pause. "Gregory, what are you telling me?" Gregory looked at his monitor. He looked at the clause. 18 lines. Plain language. Standard boilerplate that any experienced attorney would pass over without alarm, because its purpose appeared obvious and its application appeared neutral. "I'm telling you that we signed an agreement," he said carefully, "in which both parties waived claims to undisclosed assets. Your assets were fully disclosed. His disclosed assets were modest. The trust he controls does not appear in his name and was not included in his disclosure, which means it was consistent with the letter of the agreement. He wasn't claiming ownership of trust-held assets." The silence on the line had a different texture now. "The clause you signed," Gregory continued, "waives your claim to anything not on his schedule. The trust holds 22% of Arlon. The Arlon deal you've been building your team's valuation has the company at around 300 million. 22% of that is, I can do the math," Vanessa said. Her voice was very quiet. "There's no mechanism to reopen," Gregory said. The waiver was mutual and voluntary. Judge Weston accepted it. "The settlement is final." A long pause. "Is there any argument that the trust constitutes a marital asset?" Gregory had already thought about this. He had thought about it during the phone call with his Delaware colleague, and during the 10 minutes before he called Vanessa, and during the 4 times he had reread the clause. "It was established before the marriage began," he said. "The capitalization predates your relationship by 3 years. There's no marital contribution to the trust structure." Another silence. Vanessa did not say anything dramatic. She did not raise her voice. She was, in the end, the product of the same discipline that had built Vantage Capital Group. She controlled her reactions, especially when she had no good options. She pressed the instinct to argue down and held it there. "All right," she said. Her voice was level. "Vanessa, I understand, Gregory." A pause. "Thank you for calling." She ended the call. Gregory sat in his dark office for another few minutes. He thought about the junior associates who had suppressed smiles in courtroom 14B. He thought about the man in the gray sweater and the resold shoes who had signed 6 lines without hesitation. He thought about the difference between a man who is losing and a man who is waiting. He thought, for the first time in a very long career, that he might have been the least informed person in a room he had believed he controlled entirely. He turned off his monitor. He put on his coat. He took the elevator down 31 floors and walked out into the snow, which had finally begun to thin. She did not call back that night. She sat in her apartment, the one on East 74th Street, that was now entirely hers, as the settlement had specified, in the living room with the lights on and a glass of water she was not drinking, and let herself go back through it. Not with regret. She was not, at her core, someone who dwelled productively in regret, but with the analytical rigor she applied to any situation she needed to understand. The consulting work. The years when Ethan had managed everything at home so she could build Vantage without distraction. She had interpreted that as dependence, as accommodation, as a man who had found a comfortable position in the slipstream of someone more driven. She had not considered that a man with genuine financial intelligence, who chose to operate quietly, might look exactly the same from the outside as a man with nothing happening. She had not considered that patience, applied strategically, was one of the most powerful positions in any negotiation. She had not considered that the reason he had not argued in the courthouse, in the settlement, during the months of the proceeding when she had expected him to fight, was not that he had nothing to fight with. It was that he had already won, not through aggression, not through maneuvering that required her to be outplayed in real time. He had simply known things she didn't know, structured a position years before any of this began, and then waited for her to reach her own conclusions about what was happening. The divorce was not the event. The divorce was the mechanism. She had moved through it as the controlling party, the one with the documentation, and the attorney, and the clear financial dominance, and she had arrived at the outcome she wanted: total separation, clean terms, no lingering entanglement. What she had not seen was that the outcome she wanted and the outcome he had designed were not the same outcome wearing different labels. They were 2 different outcomes. She had gotten hers, he had gotten his. She had walked through a door she thought she was opening and found herself exactly where he needed her to be. She sat with this for a long time. Outside, the snow had stopped. The city was quiet in the way it gets after a heavy snowfall, muffled, briefly still, the ordinary sounds of commerce and motion absorbed into white. From her window she could see the park, the trees stripped bare and dusted, the lights along the path catching the crystals on the branches. She thought about their daughter, who was at her father's apartment tonight. She thought about the first time she had seen Ethan, at a dinner in Boston 11 years ago, and the way he had listened, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually listening, the way she had later learned was unusual. She had thought then that it was simply good manners. Later, she had revised that to kindness. She was revising it again now, to something that didn't have a simple name. She picked up her phone and set it back down without calling anyone. There was nothing to call about. The settlement was final. The clause was signed. The position was exactly what it was. Vantage Capital Group was still a company she had built from nothing, and still controlled entirely. She was still, by any external measure, someone who had won. The Arlon deal would need to be renegotiated from a weaker position. That was real. She would manage it. She always managed things. She stood. She went to the window. She looked at the park, and she thought about the gray sweater and the resoled shoes and the man who had signed 6 lines without hesitation and walked out into the snow without looking back, and she understood, with the clarity that comes from seeing something only after the moment has passed, that she had been looking at him for 11 years without understanding what she was seeing. Not a man without direction. A man who had chosen a direction she couldn't see. Ethan picked Lily up from school on Friday at 3:15. She was wearing a red coat and holding a drawing she had made in art class, a house with smoke coming from the chimney. A figure in the yard that had yellow hair in wild loops. "That's you," she said, pointing to the figure. "I made your hair curly." "My hair isn't curly. In my drawing it is." She climbed into the back seat. "Did everything go okay, Dad?" "Yes," he said. "Everything went okay." He pulled away from the school and drove through streets that were still slushy from the snow. The plows had been through, but the gutters were running gray, and the sidewalks were tracked with boot prints. The city looked like itself again, loud and functional and indifferent, the snow already becoming a thing that had happened rather than a thing that was happening. His phone buzzed on the seat beside him. "Carter. Monday terms will be favorable. Webb called me this morning. He wants to talk directly." He glanced at it. He would respond later. Lily was telling him about something that had happened at lunch, a disagreement about whose ball it was, resolved eventually by a teacher, or maybe not resolved. It wasn't entirely clear, and he listened. Watching the road, nodding at the parts that required a nod, asking a question at the right moment. He drove past the courthouse. He didn't look at it. There was nothing in particular to look at. It was a building that had been the setting for a single morning, in a much longer sequence of events. The gavel had come down. The snow had been falling. The junior associates had pressed their lips together. All of that had happened. And it was over. And the rest of it was already in motion. He made a right on 5th. Lily had moved on to a description of a book she was reading. Something about a girl who found a door in her basement that led somewhere unexpected. "She doesn't tell anyone at first," Lily said, "because she knows they wouldn't believe her." "That's smart," Ethan said. "I would tell someone," Lily said. "I'd tell you." He looked at her in the rearview mirror. She was looking out the window at the city going by, her red coat vivid against the gray of the back seat. The yellow loops of her drawn hair were visible in the corner of his eye. The crayon figure, standing in a yard with smoke coming from the chimney. "You could always tell me," he said. She nodded, satisfied with this, and went back to the book description. He drove. The city moved around them. Taxis, and buses, and pedestrians, and delivery trucks, and the particular urban river of motion that doesn't stop and doesn't slow, and does not care at all what has just concluded, or what is about to begin. He merged into traffic on the highway, settled in behind a blue sedan, and drove north into the last of the afternoon. He had won. He knew it. He did not need to think about it further. What mattered now was simpler. Dinner, homework, a book before bed. A phone call with Carter in the evening that would last 30 minutes and cover the framework for Monday. The earn-out extension he had proposed, which was not merely a negotiating tactic, but a genuine belief that Marcus Webb had built something that deserved more than a compressed 3-year window to demonstrate its value. The rest, the clause, the courthouse, the moment in the glass-walled conference room, when Vanessa had said his name was already receding into the category of things that had been necessary and were now complete. He had not set out to embarrass her. That had never been the point. The point was simpler and older than the divorce: to protect what he had built, to protect his daughter's future, and to do it in a way that required no performance, no grievance, no extended argument in a marble courthouse before a judge and an audience of people suppressing smiles. He had simply built something real, quietly, over a long period of time. And then he had waited for the moment when its reality would become visible. That moment had arrived. It had lasted 90 minutes, in a conference room, in Midtown. And now it was over. And the thing that mattered was the 8-year-old in the back seat telling him about the girl who found a door in her basement. He had not corrected Vanessa's understanding of who he was. He had simply allowed reality to do it for him. The Arlon acquisition closed 11 months later. The terms were, in the end, close to what Ethan had proposed at that first Thursday meeting. A 5-year earnout, an elevated equity role, and a structure that Marcus Webb had described to a colleague afterward as the most fair I've ever seen in a deal this size. Westfield Capital had taken the lead position. Crestfield Technology Trust had been a co-investor of record, its beneficial ownership properly registered and disclosed in the closing documents. The deal was covered briefly in 2 financial publications. Neither article mentioned Ethan Cole by name. One listed Crestfield among the investors in a single sentence. The other did not mention it at all. This was, Ethan felt, about right. Carter Wells sent a message the day the deal closed. It contained no words. It was a photograph of the 2 of them at that dinner in Boston. 11 years earlier, a candid someone had taken without their noticing. 2 men at the end of a long table with coffee cups and notebooks between them, talking. He had not known the photograph existed. He looked at it for a while. He showed it to Lily that evening. "Who's that?" she said, pointing to her father's younger face. "Me," he said. "A long time ago." "You look the same," she said, which was not strictly accurate but was, he thought, a kind thing to say. He put the phone away. Outside, it was May. The trees were coming back. The city was loud with it, the particular loudness of a cold place, remembering that warmth is possible, people moving faster, faces turned upward, coffee drunk outside on sidewalks that 4 months ago had been buried in white. He had never thought of himself as someone who had won something. He thought of himself as someone who had done a thing carefully, and waited a long time, and trusted that the doing and the waiting would eventually be enough. It had been enough. Vanessa, for her part, had moved forward. She was meticulous about that too, about not being defined by a single event, however illuminating it had proven to be. She had renegotiated with Westfield from a position of reduced leverage and had come away with terms she could work with. She had been honest with her board about the restructured deal without volunteering more than was necessary. She had spent a weekend in March reading everything she could find about trust law in Delaware and the specific mechanics of beneficial ownership, which she should have done 18 months earlier, but there was no productive way to live in that observation. She was still who she was. She had still built what she had built. She had simply, in this one case, underestimated the person she had spent 11 years nearest to. She had mistaken his stillness for stasis, his patience for passivity, his choice to work invisibly as an inability to be visible. She did not make that kind of mistake easily, and she would not make it again. He went downstairs to make dinner. Lily was at the kitchen table doing homework, her sneakers propped on the chair rung, her pencil moving in slow loops. She looked up when he came in. "What are we having?" "I haven't decided," he said. "Something good," she said, with the authority of someone who expected this request to be honored. "Obviously," he said. He opened the refrigerator. He started cooking. Through the kitchen window, the city stretched south and west in the early evening light. All glass and stone in motion, enormous and continuous, and entirely unaware of any particular story unfolding within it. Somewhere in that city, Gregory Hale was working a case that was not this one. Marcus Webb was back at his desk, rebuilding something that now had the capital it had always deserved. Carter Wells was in Boston, probably monitoring the next position in a category the major funds hadn't found yet. And Ethan Cole was making dinner. The snow was gone. The city didn't remember it. Cities don't carry memory the way people do, they absorb and continue. The white surface that had blanketed Foley Square on that Tuesday morning, already 3 seasons behind, gone without ceremony, replaced by the ordinary business of living in a place that does not pause. But some things, done quietly and built well, don't need to be remembered by the city to have changed what the city contains. Ethan Cole knew this. He always had. The pasta water was coming to a boil. Lily had abandoned her homework to draw something on the back of a worksheet. He could see the colored pencils spreading across the table in her distinctive way, every available surface, eventually becoming a surface for something. He let it go. There was time for the homework. There was, he had come to understand, always time for the right things when you had arranged the rest of the structure correctly. Outside, the last of the evening light was fading. The city was settling into its nighttime register, louder in some ways, quieter in others, the particular frequency of a place that never fully rests but changes its key after dark. He salted the water. He turned down the heat. He listened to Lily humming something to herself, while she drew, some fragment of a song she had half learned, and was completing with invented syllables, the way children fill in the gaps they don't yet know. He thought, this is the thing that was worth protecting, not the money, not the position, not the 22% of a company he had identified 4 years ago, and quietly held, and would now convert into the next thing and the thing after that. All of that was real and useful, and had been worth doing. But this dinner, the light going out of the window, a small person drawing at the kitchen table, and humming a song she was making up as she went. This was the architecture the rest had been built to protect. He had not told anyone this. There was no one who needed to hear it. It was simply true, in the way that the most important things often are, quietly, without announcement, and for a long time before anyone thinks to ask.